Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to talk again to Dr. Shoaib Ahmed Malik. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you so much for inviting me again to your channel, Paul.
It's great to see you. Always an honored guest on the channel. Shoaib is many things, but I just want to mention he is the author of this book, Islam and Evolution, Al-Ghazali and the Modern Evolutionary Paradigm, published by Routledge in 2021, which was chosen as the best academic book of science and religion by the International Society for Science and Religion in 2022. Now, you recently, did you not, announced some fantastic news about a new academic appointment. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so alhamdulillah, back in February, March in 2024, there was a short listing of a few people to, be considered for a position on Lecturer of Science and Religion at the University of Edinburgh. So I flew in, I did my piece, I went through the interview. Alhamdulillah, I was awarded that position. This is the first time.
Congratulations.
It's everything is from Allah, alhamdulillah. And this is the first time, as far as I can tell, that a Muslim has been given a position like this, somebody who has expertise in Islam and science. And following from one of the previous videos that we did earlier, remember the big news about Islam and science that we did?
Yeah.
This was when I was in Turkey, when the elections were going on. I don't know if you remember, right? So
different era. Okay.
That was a huge thing because we were able to set up two book series, right? So one with Palgrave, one with Cambridge. Now, this is, another addition to building up the infrastructure for the field. So hopefully through this role, I'll be able to do a lot of things. And one of the things I've already been told to do, bear in mind, I don't start until August, the 1st of August. I've already been told to devise and develop a postgraduate module in Islam and science, which will eventually be integrated into their online and offline master's program. So a lot of exciting things. Things.
Is this kind of a pioneering work? Is it you're doing here, like in Britain or the West in general? I mean, just how pioneering is this, what you're doing?
I don't like to claim myself as a pioneer. I think that's a little too self-aggrandizing. But all I'd say is that it's definitely a new development. I think it will put Islam and science on a new footing without a shadow of a doubt. As far as I can tell, this will be the first time you have a solid program offered by, a Russell Group university. And you can do this program whether you are, in the UK or anywhere else in the world, because it'll be offered as an online option as well. In addition to that, because most of the faculty members here are very well versed with Christianity, they didn't have anyone to do Islam and science topics. We are now also able to supervise PhD students who want to do any research in the area of Islam and science. So this is now entering a whole new, I think, phase for the field. And I'm very excited to see what I can do for the next 30, 40 years, inshallah.
Oh, it's a fantastic opportunity, and congratulations on that. And we're just really looking forward to seeing what develops from this. I mean, Edinburgh University is a very prestigious university, not just in Scotland, but in the West. Like, incredible intellectual tradition going back literally centuries. And yourself, you actually have two PhDs, one in science and one in theology. So perhaps you're uniquely qualified to talk on the relationship between Islam and science as well. So that's amazing news. Now, a couple of weeks ago, you contacted me about doing this podcast about reading. So tell us all what you had in mind.
Right. So it wasn't a couple of weeks, actually a few months ago, Paul. it was a while back. So, right. Yeah. So I'm sure you've been getting a lot of questions, right? Like, how do you go about reading? What are the tips that you have? And so, I've written a few things down here and there, but I felt like rather than having these isolated pieces and constantly, repeating myself, why not have a dedicated video? And I feel like one of my partner in crimes in terms of reading and just really enjoying books, was none other than yourself, Paul.
I didn't know reading was a crime. Maybe in some countries, but still in the UK. So, that's what you read, though. There's certain books I wouldn't talk about publicly that one might have read, but
right.
No, I was very honored and touched, actually. You even thought of asking us to do this together, and I think it's a fantastic idea. I don't know why we didn't do it before, really, but anyway, we've got around to it now. So you have a kind of informal structure, but you want to keep this organic, really, don't you? But what's your initial play on this about reading? What's your
Right. So just for the people out there, I mean, none of this is scripted. Like I don't have a presentation slide, neither does Paul. We just want to keep it open-ended and organic, and just see where things go. But as a rough, like, blueprint for today's session, so to speak, what I wanted to do was start off with what was our relationship with books like when we were younger? Because some people, think that, oh, maybe it's a skill you're supposed to have, since you were a kid. Like skating. Skating is not something you kind of develop. It's something if you're trained at it, if you train at it when you're younger, then it becomes second-handed to you. So let's start off with that, Paul. What was your relationship like? Were you always around books, or did that just develop at a much later time in your life? What was your relationship?
Yeah, I mean, this is all very personal, because I had a troubled relationship with books, actually.
Oh, really? I
Yeah.
wasn't expecting that. Okay.
No, really. And I haven't really discussed this on YouTube, before, so I'm not sure I should really, but I don't think it's inappropriate. I'm not going to betray any confidence or anything, but no, I had a relationship. So I had at school, I was pretty much this is how I perceive myself, by the way. At school, I was pretty much a failure, and not being academically successful in the early years at school at all. But I was a late developer, to be honest. And I remember I started to read at an early age books on philosophy. I remember I used to sit in front of the Open University TV station. They had it at that time, and sort of watch programs about philosophy or music or whatever. But and that kind of had this twin track existence. On the one hand, I was really not doing well at school for all sorts of reasons, but privately, I developed this interest in books, and I remember it was fairly secret, actually. I felt that there was something very odd about what I was doing, and I kind of kept it private, even from my parents. So, so I remember in my early teens, my interests were very much politics. I was interested in philosophy, political philosophy, Marxism, history, and classical music, I guess. And so, yeah, those are my main interests. That's it. Religion was much later, in my 20s, when I became a Christian. Suddenly that light bulb switched on. Theology. But before that, philosophy and history, I guess, were my main passions, I guess.
So just to be clear, Paul, you were never encouraged by your family or your parents to go out and read? This was something that just developed naturally?
Yeah. No, my parents had a small, very small library of books, and I used to sort of secretly look at those and borrow them occasionally. No, it wasn't encouraged. It was simply ignored. It was so whatever interest I showed grew organically and naturally and privately over the years, and I feel very awkward talking about it, to be honest, because it wasn't a happy time. But so my passion for books has always been intensely personal and private. It's never been formally, well, not never. It's not normally formally expressed in accreditation at universities. I've never gone down that professional route. It's always been a personal quest and obsession. It's like, well, we all have appetites, but one of my fundamental appetites is reading. And I could no more stop reading than I could stop breathing. And I did try. I did try. I remember, I think in my early trial, I thought, this is ridiculous, this is reading all the time. I think I succeeded for about 48 hours and not reading or something stupid. But no, it's just part of who I am. So when people ask me, "Oh, Paul, what reading? How do I read? What strategies do you adopt? How do you do it?" I'm thinking, that's not how I think. How do you develop an appetite for food? How do you? What strategy do you adopt for breathing? It's a silly question, and I don't mean it's a silly question they're asking me. It's not, but far from it. But it's not something I've had to cultivate. It's something I've had to kind of organically grow with, and I have strategies now about how I read books. Maybe we'll come on to that. But it is very much an instinctual, natural thing. It's not something I have tried to cultivate in any formal way, really.
Right.
Okay. All that I wanted to say. You got it out of me. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's very interesting, Paul. So I was a late bloomer as well. I wasn't. Really? So my parents tell me that I was a very sharp kid, but I never fully applied myself. That's what my parents told me, right? That I would. My teachers recognized I had the potential to be the top of the class, but I just never pushed myself. So just to give you an idea, when I was doing my A levels, I would sleep in class. I would constantly sleep in class, and I would just revise 2 weeks before the exam, and I could get the A. I didn't have a problem with my A levels, so to speak. There was this really sweet moment, and I will just I just cherish this moment. Did you have parents meetings when you were younger? Like,
Oh,
your parents, yeah.
Oh,
So the
right.
dreaded parents meetings, right? Oh, I just hated those. And there was this one episode that's like literally the jewel on the chair of my experiences. And this is where one of my teachers, she was my math teacher, and she gave me an E because in the mock exam I failed it. Like I flunked it, right? And then the actual exam, I just revised 2 weeks before it, like solidly, and I got an A star. So I was like literally, and so in the parent teacher meeting, my parents went up to them, and she had nothing to say, and I was like, yes. so like, I mean, that was one of my best. It wasn't that was the only shining moment in parenting. Everything else was really, it's in the dark. But but for me, I think I share to a large extent your experience of developing this organically. I was very hooked on to games. I remember in my time we had Sega and PlayStation 1. That was mostly the things that I was very hooked on. That's why, and to such an extent, I actually wanted to become a game developer when I was choosing my undergraduate degrees. The first thing that was on my mind was graphics. I wanted to get into graphics.
Yeah.
My mom, then she I mean, I wasn't very religiously informed. This is me just being a cultural Muslim. So my mom, she said that, Shoaib, there's a debate amongst Muslim scholars about whether drawing is haram or halal. So I just took that as whatever little I knew. Okay, I won't do that. So as you do, I'm good in chemistry, good in math, just go straight into engineering. So that was it. That's the only reason why I chose chemical engineering. There's nothing more behind it. And anyways, for me personally, where it started developing was actually through comics. I was a huge fiction fan. So I don't know if you remember. Did you guys have Archie comics? It's a very used thing, but do you guys have Archie comics in the UK?
Possibly, but I don't know. Sorry.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah. So I used to read a lot of Archie comics, and then I got into Goosebumps. I don't know if you know Goosebumps. These are like these scary horror stories. Those were like the main things that got me hooked into fiction. And then after Goosebumps, it was straight into Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. Like that was my bread and butter. I was just into reading that to such an extent. I remember my mom, so she had to force me to study because I was just not very studious at all. I mean, people might be surprised now, but I wasn't a very studious person. I was a very late bloomer.
Well, why was it? Because you found the school just boring because it was so elementary in terms of your own abilities. It didn't give you any great interest because you're on a different level, and so you just switched off and slept, or
no, I didn't find the ideas to be interesting. I remember, I mean, like some topics were very interesting. So chemistry was actually one of my favorite topics because of the teacher. His name was Mr. Price. So he was from the UK. He was a Welsh chap, very lovely guy, right? And he made chemistry so fun. He made it so interesting. Other subjects, they were just dull. We had an ex-military teacher, who's very aged, and the way he just taught math was just so archaic, and you couldn't really relate to the subject. And so he had this wooden stick as well, so he fit the stereotype of the old generation math teacher, right? And so with some subjects, I did very well in math. I was very, very good in math. It was just that it just depended on the way the teacher approached it. And those were the initial cue points for me when I started practicing as a teacher. What do I not want to be? I don't want to be the boring teacher. I don't want to be the non-interactive teacher. I don't want to just dump knowledge onto the student. I want to make it fun for the individual. And so it's just that it had nothing to do with me being like super smart. That's my son. My son is like that. He's very different to me. But for me, it was just about, I wasn't just engaged. It was just not delivered in a way where I could enjoy what was being taught. And for that reason, I remember when I was studying for my GCSEs, I unfortunately I made the grave mistake of taking business studies as an option. And I remember my mom, she had to sit me down so I could study. Like that's how bad of a student I was. So what I ended up doing with Paul was, so you had the textbook, and I would slip in a comic book, and she would think I'd be reading the business textbook. So and I remember that.
Gosh.
I got caught, and I had proper beats that day. But But that was my experience, and and just to give you an idea, I was very like uninformed about things beyond the remit of school. So my awareness of disciplines was also very, very weak. So I knew about physics, I knew about chemistry, knew about math, knew about history, geography, whatever was laid out in school. But anything outside of that, I didn't know of. I'm just to give you, and I'm not saying this to kind of shock anyone, but I'm just telling you what I was. At the age of 21, I did not know what was the difference between politics, philosophy, and psychology. Like that's how uninformed I was about
you were
outside of.
hyper-developed in certain scientific areas, but in other areas you were completely undeveloped.
Completely undeveloped. And so when what ended up happening for me was it actually all opened up at university. I don't know what opened up here, right? What part of my brain started developing, but as soon as I left for university, this curiosity to just learn just opened up in me. And I'm not sure whether it's because the school environment made me feel like I just didn't want to learn, but I just knew that university was an open game. Like I could do whatever I want. And I remember, even though I signed up for chemical engineering, I felt very betrayed because I was very good in. I really wanted to apply physics and math. I really liked physics quite a lot, but in chemical engineering, it's not chemistry. It's a lot of physics and math. And the problem was that because it applied a large number to chemistry channels, I didn't quite really get what I wanted from there. So I remember going into libraries and picking up books on time travel, Michikaku and all these guys, and just reading physics in my own time. I was actually solving physics textbook exercises in my own time. I don't know why. It just that natural curiosity just came out. And during my undergrad years, that's when I started really, acquiring books, going through books, and I think my mind opened up a lot during those years. But it was still very, science specific. It was like all to do with physics, all to do with math, and so. But the wider stuff I think started during my PhD. That's when I think I entered a new phase. So reading started for me through fiction, and then eventually evolved into nonfiction.
Something I'm very strongly identifying what you're saying is curiosity. That's another term that motivates my reading, is simply an insatiable curiosity about the world. I mean, there's some things I'm not curious about. I'm not curious, sadly, about, say, sport particularly, or cooking. I don't know why. I wish I could develop these interests, but there are many areas I am very, very curious about, and so I like to dive deeply in these areas over the years, and that's been absolutely or intellectual maps. The idea of cartography, developing intellectual maps of, say, the Western tradition, or Western philosophy, or Western theology, and then when I became a Muslim, discovering the world of Islamic thought, the Islamic tradition as well, and not only then digging deeper into that, which of course is a lifetime or many lifetimes project, but then relating that to the history of the West, both in terms of politics and philosophy and colonialism, but also intellectually, and the cross-fertilization we've seen between these two great traditions, and that's been driven by curiosity as well, but always with half an eye to the contemporary world, because this is the historic philosophical backdrop of where we are today. Why are we where we are today? What's the genealogy of these issues that we confront today? And so on. So it's a very holistic, integrated kind of interest that has many different prongs to it, and it's a very rich intellectual discovery process. So that's always been there since in my teens, and I've never left that behind. And the map keeps on getting richer and deeper and more. New vistas open up. One never quite sees the edge of the map. The map is always receding ever into the distance. One never quite gets there. But of course, the more one knows, the more one realizes how little one knows. So my story is certainly one of increasing ignorance, paradoxically, because one is aware of ever more oceans of knowledge which exist in God's universe, which is limitless, really. Now I can identify with that.
So you talk about opening up vistas. I think for me, I'm now thinking while you were talking, There was a moment where so I was born and raised in Kuwait, and if you've never been to Kuwait, it's this very, very tiny speck of dust in the Middle East, right? It's a very, very small country, such that you can actually drive to any city from any city within 15, 20 minutes by car. Like that's how small we're talking about, right? So very, very small. So my understanding of even time and space was bound by Kuwait. I need you to, and that's very important because I remember when I went to the UK for the first time, my dad came with me. He showed me the ropes, right? And we landed at Heathrow, and then he went and got the train tickets. Like, okay, Shoaib, we got to wait half an hour. I'm like, okay, we wait half an hour. So like, how long's the train to Bath? Like, what, 15 minutes, 25 minutes, 30 minutes? Because those are my references. My dad started laughing at me. Shoaib, it's 2.5 hours. And I remember my face dropping. My very understanding of time and space just stretched. Like I was like, what do you mean 2.5 hours? I'm sitting in a car or in a tube for 2.5 hours. I had to really process that before I got into the train. So that was when I think even the very experience of time and space changed, because prior to that, I remember that even when we studied history, I didn't really appreciate what history was. Like when you talk about things like 3,000 years ago, what does that really mean? Right? So I think curiosity just naturally bubbled up by these shifting experiences, right? And I think that really, drove that process for me. Like, why do I believe what I believe? It's also during the time that I wanted to see why am I Muslim, right? It was during the end of my undergrad, in the beginning of, for those of you who don't know, I never did a master's. I went straight from bachelor's to PhD. So that's why I talk about either undergrad or my PhD. It was during my PhD I started questioning, what my parents are Muslim. Why am I Muslim? So I think that curiosity really kind of drove me forward. But I have to say that during my undergraduate, which I think was also a very important thing, was a working ethic. I developed a really strong working ethic, and that was something very different to what I was at school. In school, I really didn't have a strong working ethic in any shape or form. But I think partly maybe because my parents were working very hard to get me to the UK. I think that pressure was always there behind me. And I always had this sense of I did not want to disappoint. And I think I'm very thankful for that, because you don't want to disappoint your parents. I mean, my dad was paying, I don't know, 25,000 pounds a year just for me to be in the UK. That's not a small amount of money. And so I think that forced me to work hard. I remember I had schedules, and I remember even after every class, I started making notes, right? And that working ethic solidified in me to, learn, make sure any ambiguities that I had, I'll check with the professor. That all developed during my undergraduate days. So there was this working ethic that allowed me to concentrate my reading. Did you have anything like that in your circumstances, Paul? Or was it a little bit, you went everywhere and it wasn't as structured for you?
No, it wasn't as structured at all. And I think our paths, although they have ultimately, we have parallel lives in some ways, but I think early on they were very, very different. I mean, if I give it one example, I got this book out earlier. This book is almost at random: Forgery and Counter-Forgery, The Use of Literary Deceit in Early Christian Polemics by the famous Bart Ehrman. This is an academic book it's written at a scholarly level, 600 pages long. Now, the reason I mention this, about 4 or 5 years ago, it illustrates the predicament I was in. Much is not the case now, but certainly I was then. So I read this book, and I actually read it at work because I was in a job which wasn't very busy, shall we say, and I was actually allowed to read during downtime when there wasn't much work to do. So I had a whole shelf of books in my office at work, which I was allowed quite openly to read, and I did that. So I read this book, and about 5 or 6 years ago, and I remember at the end of it being totally fascinated by this discussion about the nature of forgery in the ancient world, and the fact that it wasn't at all approved of, and it was censored quite heavily by the churches, and yet there were these forgeries and so on. And I remember at the end of it thinking, wow, I've read this book, 600 pages of scholarly work, and I felt devastated because there was no one I knew I could talk to about it. It was a wholly it was almost like a solipsistic experience. It was just me and my world. Who can I talk to about this? And there was no one, because no one had read this, of course, that I knew. and also it was very obscure and scholarly, and yet I really wanted to unburden myself, and there was no one to talk to about it. And I actually felt a sense of desolation after reading it. There was a really mixed with fascination as well. And that was one of the things that, again, organically through the COVID lockdown, when I began to do videos online on YouTube, where a lot of it was propelled by my need simply to talk about this stuff, which I hadn't been able to before. And that's how the thing just naturally developed. But yeah, so my relationship book has often been quite isolating, because in a sense, the more one knows, and this one's part of a network community, it can actually make you more and more you're set apart from other people in a way, because one's not really part of a community of thinkers. But that, of course, has changed totally in the last 3 or 4 years. Whereas that's not the case at all now. I'm very much connected with a lot of brilliant people, and that's been a great blessing to me. So yeah, yeah.
Well, it's amazing, Paul, that your initial reading experiences made you feel isolated, but now look, you're now running one of the largest YouTube channels, that's talking about books, that's talking about Islam. SubhanAllah, it just shows, you're planning one thing, Allah's planning other things.
Absolutely.
For you.
No, this is true. Yeah. So no, it was, I say, it's not now. So it's very cathartic for me. It's very liberating, and as you say, God has opened this particular platform so we can talk about these issues. But for a long time, it wasn't like that, and so it wasn't happy. So I'm now able to share this universe of experiences with people, and that's an amazing privilege, and I'm very happy about that.
If I may ask, Paul, what was your vocation? What did you work as?
I'm not going to. It was just an office job. That guy going into details.
Okay.
Now,
okay.
But it was one where there was a lot of downtime, and for some reason my manager thought, if you want to read, Paul, go ahead. And I really took full opportunity, full advantage of that. And but I left in the end because I didn't like the job and it wasn't helping me at all.
Right, fair enough.
I was able to do this.
Alhamdulillah. So I actually resonate a lot with you in the sense that you felt isolated. So when I started reading, naturally, when you become a very bookish person, the people that you can relate to and talk to becomes thinner and thinner and thinner, right?
Exactly.
I remember, because of my gaming background and just, I was all about games back in the day. Really, it was just, people who were sharing PlayStation 5 or PlayStation 4, right? That was really the thing for me. Or computer. I don't know if you remember these LAN parties where you play online Counter-Strike and all of that. So I was into that. That really was my thing back in the day. As soon as I started becoming a book person, naturally, even my sense of friends and community changed. Like a lot of the people that I used to hang out with, I didn't hang out with them anymore. And I did feel, to some extent, I was self-ostracizing, because I just couldn't relate to people anymore, because I didn't have, like you said, you have all these things that you want to talk about. Who can you talk to about them? And so I remember feeling something like, what is this really worth it if it's divorcing me from some people? But at the end of the day, my curiosity got the betterment of me, right? So I wanted to really go out there, and I felt like a meaningful life is really worth pursuing if it involves that you go out and read, and you have to shed some friends. So be it. I didn't have a problem. Did you have that attitude as well? I'm assuming?
Exactly the same. And I found, just changing the tack slightly, I found certain writers and thinkers who have profoundly influenced the way I express myself, the way I write, the way I read. And one of them, I mentioned this book so many times, but I'm shameless about it. Guy Eaton, Islam, the Destiny of Man. Guy Eaton was a British diplomat. He was a Muslim convert for 50 years when he passed away. He was an English guy. And this particular book and his whole writing style and other books is extraordinary. He was a master of the English language. And I remember reveling in his prose as much as the spirituality and the Islam that he understood and wrote in this seminal work. A lot of people have been influenced by it. And that was another, always been an interest of mine. Again, nothing to do with school. School never nurtured this for me. Yeah. It's very sad. And that is poetry. I remember in I was 16, 17, being absolutely obsessed with John Donne. John Donne was a so-called metaphysical poet in England in the 17th century. And his poetry was radical at that time. It was difficult, deliberately difficult, and intellectually very powerful, and seductive, and it was wildly popular then. He's very, very popular now. And so his life and thought and poetry influenced me hugely then as well. Enjoying language, just the words, the language. And I remember about 3 or 4 years ago, this is the Oxford Book of English Verse, published by Oxford University Press, obviously. And I remember I set myself the task, and this is English poetry from I don't know, what's the earliest date here? It goes right back to 700 years to the 14th century, the 13th century, up to today. And I decided to read one poem a day. Whatever I thought about the poem, whether or not I liked it was not the point. I forced myself to read what was presented to me as the canon of English literature. And I did it, about 800-900 poems. Over several years, I read this. And that was an absolutely extraordinary experience, how English has changed and evolved, how words have changed, and how poetic styles, sonnets to going to how that's evolved and changed. And that satisfied my need for kind of concentrated poetic language, which I've always found very, very enjoyable, and very, it's just a beautiful experience. So poetry has been another interest of mine, apart from the more intellectual philosophy and theology. Has that been, have you ever, I mean, do you still like fiction yourself? Do you still read Tolkien?
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I don't have the time for fiction anymore. So I rely a lot on science fiction movies to kind of really, because they stir a lot of thought. Like what fiction does really well that you don't find in nonfiction is get you to imagine, possible worlds that you may not have the time to sit and think about properly. What are the entailments of that? So I like fiction because it kind of takes me away into these imaginal worlds out there. I just don't have the time because of my research, but I do hope to read here and there when I can. Like right now, I'm mostly interested in AI. So a lot of books related to that subject matter are coming to the fore. But coming to the point about poetry, the person who really kind of expanded my mind was Rumi. Rumi's poetry. Really, I remember buying that. It was the old one. Who was it? Nicholson, Richard Nicholson, or Reynold Nicholson, was his name. Yeah, so the 5 volumes that I bought it, and I was just mesmerized by the way he would use mundane like affairs of the world and bring out such eloquence and just sharp imagery in your mind. Like I remember there was one, and I might be misquoting it, but he was talking about, at least what I inferred from was empiricism, where if you believe it's just your 5 senses that define the world. And he said that imagine a fly on a leaf, and that leaf is floating on urine. That's the limit of your senses, that you cannot see that all you are is just on urine. I mean, just sharp imagery. I'm like, I never thought about stuff like that, prior to Rumi. Rumi really kind of expanded my mind. Like I call him the master of metaphors, because that's really what he is. He's so brilliant at that. And he was actually another one of the key sources for me who, helped me with my teaching. Because in science in particular, when you want to relay some very abstract concepts, having the right analogy or metaphor is key to conveying that. So I really appreciated Rumi quite a lot. In 2 respects. One, because it helped me understand Islam a bit more. Like from one angle, you can consider his poetry as like a tafsir of the Quran. It's a very beautiful way of bringing out the message of the Quran. But also because it helps you understand the power of metaphor. Like I really, really like understanding metaphors very carefully, because it draws on cultural experiences. So you're entering new reference points, and it just opened up new vistas for me. Really, it was a very, very. I remember being blown away with me.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar. I mean, I agree. A similar experience I had with this poet, T.S. Eliot, half American, half English. The 4 quartets, particularly. He's a 20th century poet. And I've always been mesmerized by his poetry, which again is quite difficult, but nevertheless it's a very profound and entrancing. And one can live with poets and their writing over time, and they seem to disclose new vistas, new realities as one comes back to them and is refreshed in one's encounter with them. So Chiazet won the Nobel Prize for literature, of course, for mainly for this very thin poem, but I found him on and off a companion, a poetic companion over the years, to be honest, along with John Donne and other poets as well. They seem to feed me in a way that other literature can't, kind of fact-based or historical narratives. This enters the world of metaphor, as you say. They're paradigm shifting. They help you see reality in different ways, disclosing new truths. And also, it's a kind of a form of time travel as well, reading ancient poets as well, poets from centuries before, because they inhabit a different world, and one can brush by them, one can even talk with them in a way, and learn from their perspectives, and remind us that our world we live in is not just natural in the way it is. It's a highly particular, contingent reality, and other people have lived different realities in the past, and one can still access that past through their deposits, their writings. And that's another reason I like Plato so much, like his dialogues, the Republic and so on. It's 2,500 years ago, and the guy was a complete genius. And he can be read on so many levels: politically, philosophically, spiritually, theologically, or just as literature, because he wrote amazing literature. These dialogues are these conversations between Socrates and other dudes about anything, the meaning of life, what is virtue, how do we know things, and so on. Absolutely incredible. And his thought has been ricocheting down the centuries ever since. So it is a sense of entering into Athens 2,500 years ago. And in particular, we've got a good critical edition of, say, the Republic by Penguin or Oxford, something like that, with all the notes, because you come across these kind of strange practices the ancient Athenians had about food or about other people, and it's like, wow, that's how they thought about life then. And it's a sense of contact where suddenly space-time collapses and you're there in that world of ancient Greece 2.5 millennia ago. So that gives me a kick as well, actually. And also encountering great geniuses like Immanuel Kant, I mentioned before, Critic of Pure Reason, and just really sitting at the feet of someone who is clearly one of the most extraordinary geniuses in history, and not really agreeing with him much, but there is that encounter too, these intellectual Everests, Mount Everests, that one can try and scale a little bit, and that's huge fun, great fun as well. So it's a whole universe, isn't it, of experiences and people and historical epochs and journeys and paradigm shifting encounters with writers, and what's not to like? How can I get to read, Paul? Well, what do you mean? I mean, there's all that. Is everything? Why does one need a motive? One simply dives in and starts swimming, and hopefully doesn't drown, and the adventure begins. And so lifetimes. There's never enough time. There's never enough lifetimes really to do it all. But no, it's great fun. To be honest, it's fun at the end of the day.
Yeah, and when you were talking about Plato, you reminded me of how I got introduced to philosophy. It was actually through Plato. Interestingly enough, when I was, I think it was in the middle of my PhD. I remember my first one. I remember I started becoming good friends with a guy who was in political science. His name was Hadi Abbas. He was in Nottingham. And he was somebody who was, incredibly well read and very raw, in terms of like current state of affairs. And I don't know what drew us together, but we just clicked. Like we became like really good friends. I remember hanging out quite a lot, and we just started having some very deep, meaningful conversations. What is reality? What is truth? What is beauty? And that just became a trigger point in him telling me, Shoaib, you need to read philosophy. He's the one who actually encouraged me, go and read Plato and Aristotle. And I remember, so that new volume, the one on Plato's work, collected works. Like, so I got that, and I remember reading through that, and my mind was just blown away. Like the fact that Plato talked about, we are, we have souls, and we're now recollecting our understanding of what that reality is. Stuff like, that the soul is, eternal, and I'm like, what? And I still remember Euthyphro's dilemma, the fact, is something good because it's inherently good, or is something good because God said so? And I'm like, I'm stuck at this question. Like, how do I address this question? And it just opened up I mean, amazing new like worlds for me. And I was like thinking, I remember just 3 months, an obsession with Plato, just finishing his works. And that was just mind-opening experience, such a mind-opening experience. And I've without a doubt, if I had not, I mean, I agree with you that encountering these great scholars and reading their works, I think if you've not done that, I think you really missed out. I genuinely believe you missed out.
Yeah, I know. I couldn't agree with you more. I absolutely agree with you. There's our experience of life is not bounded by going around in the present. As I said before, one can go back into the past, and what one can encounter great minds, great people through their artifacts, which is usually their written work. And that's part of the adventure of reading. I mentioned Plato. I could mention so many others. Aristotle, of course, his pupil, and even great in the Western tradition, great Christian thinkers like, I mean, I've begun to recognize certain types of surpassing genius, so beyond my own personal life. But St. Augustine was one of those people. His book, De Civitatis Dei, The City of God, or his confessions, his confession of praise to God, or confession of sins, and to be ambiguous. This is the first autobiography that in the West ever written. This guy was a Roman citizen in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, and he's talking about his childhood, his experience of education, what it was like having bad teachers, good teachers, how some would beat them, and how some would really excite their students to learn. And then he'd talk about this and that, and an extraordinary, intoxicating work infused with a profound spirituality. But his largesse of mind, he had an ocean of consciousness, and you really get the sense that this guy could survey the world within his own limitations in a way that really was very unusual. And then I encountered it again. I encountered it in Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali and Augustine are very similar in that way. They're both extraordinary minds, and that they encompass everything. They're not like me in my little areas which I ferret around in and drill down. This guy was colossal, Al-Ghazali, just like Augustine. And I recognize it, and Plato, before Plato was saying, it's encyclopedic, all-encompassing, all-engrossing interest in absolutely everything. And that's incredible experience to be able to say hi to these people in a very distant way, and actually listen to their discourse, listen to their endless exploration of reality. And there are others, of course, but those three, Plato, Al-Ghazali, and Augustine, are special to me. And there are others more controversial. I think Ibn Taymiyyah, maybe not on that top rank, but very close to it. I think Ibn Taymiyyah is very close to that. Anyway, but yeah, I noticed you responded to something I said.
Yeah, no, I mean, Augustine, hands down. I mean, I really enjoy his work. I personally enjoyed the fact that, that he came from a very challenged background. Like he wasn't the most practicing guy on the block, right? And then for him to have that radical transformation. I also had a lot of respect for Aquinas. Like when he wanted to join the order, right? Like his family did everything to not let that happen, including trying to get him seduced by, and I was like,
extraordinary,
the fortitude, man, the fortitude. I mean, wow, just like wow. I mean, I just developed an immense amount of respect. But interestingly enough, from the Western Christian corpus, the entry point for me was Boethius, Consolation of Philosophy. And I remember reading that, and again, sharp like metaphors, like how philosophy came in the form of a woman, and he's having this engagement. Completely just blew my mind. And I think that exploring and dipping into these works really kind of helps you be able to appreciate, one, the time and the reference, and two, also like, what does this mean for you? Because their approaches were very inquiry based. And I think that's and I think it fits into at least the time that I was in. I was very inquisitive, so this inquiry based narrative was very helpful in terms of opening up my mind. I felt,
No, and also just quickly, one other thing that again helped to expand my human sympathy as well as my appreciation for other epochs. And this is almost at random. Charles Dickens, for example, Tale of Two Cities. But there are other books like Bleak House and so on. And one of the things that impressed me about him was his
Mockingbird, How to Kill a Mockingbird as well. Yeah.
but it was profound human sympathy for flawed characters. He was a man who it wasn't narrow and judgmental. You got the sense that he really tried to empathize and understand failure and human motivation. Although he was harsh on evil characters, people who were cruel towards other people. But it was a very Dickens is quite out of fashion in some circles these days, but I found him a very ennobling figure in terms of it says enriching one's humanity. And I always came away from his books feeling a slightly better person for having encountered Charles Dickens. And he's not unique in that. George Eliot, another English writer in the 19th century, is one of the great writers. Middlemarch, again, just utterly enthralled me. It was I remember reading Middlemarch, as many people think is the greatest novel in English ever written, thinking that I just indulged in this fantastic feast, and it was like metaphors, this vast banquet of food, and the exquisite, exotic, immensely satisfying, and that was how I came away from reading her. This is I felt that I encountered this incredibly rich banquet of thought and psychological insight and human understanding about people. Which she was so brilliant at in her work, even though she was writing fiction. It was a novel, but it was much more than that. There was a depth to it, which was truly remarkable. So it wasn't just an intellectual exercise reading this book. Sometimes it was, as I say, profoundly ennobling and enriching as in one's humanity at a much deeper level than just the mere cerebral, I think.
Right. So before we get on to, we've been talking about our experiences. I think people want to know now what are our reading techniques, right? So, but before we get into that, so I think that, but this has been for me, it's been very enlightening, Paul. I mean, I now understand you much better in light of what you said. Alhamdulillah. But just to ask you, so imagine you have a parent, right? And they say, or somebody who's about to be a parent. How do you develop inquisitiveness in children? Because it seems like both me and you were driven to books because we were inquirers, right? Modern day schools, I don't think necessarily develops that. I think modern day schools, to a large extent, I think fail on that. Yeah. And I think it's largely because it's exam centric. You got to pass the exam. It's all about passing the exams.
Yeah, you're right.
And so what would you think would be a good way in developing curiosity? What do you think?
Well, that's a really good question. I would try and find what a child's interests were and try and encourage them to read great books that connected with their interests. Let them take the initiative in terms of the subject and the books themselves, in terms of their general interest, and then try and meet them where they were at. So if they showed an aptitude for mathematics or something, you could suggest things. But if they had an interest in meaning and purpose, then I might introduce them to what one of Plato's dialogues, because you mentioned Euthyphro. I mean, I first encountered Plato as a teenager, but again, it wasn't introduced at school. It was something I did in my own time. But I would try and just activate that or actualize that interest in a specific way by suggesting specific books, rather than artificially try and graft, say, oh, well, I think you ought to know about this. I mean, if they're open to that, fine. I could say, well, I'll read this. But no, I would try and find out what really switched them on and recommend something that would meet them at that stage of their journey. But it's a kind of very vague recommendation. But I think everything has to be personalized and individualized. And also, there's the time. There's also the importance. I mean, you mentioned about the appalling situation in schools where everything is exam driven, and but the opposite, the importance of wasting time, the importance of just hanging around and just lying on the couch or whatever with a book. And I mean wasting time. I don't mean just irresponsibly, but I mean just doing something that is not time driven, not something that is structured, not something that is orientated to a goal that one must succeed in doing, but just kind of leisurely relaxing and just chilling and exploring in a very different mode rather than purpose-driven mode. And I think that then one can awaken one's interest much more naturally and organically. rather than trying to force someone down a channel towards a goal. If that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, with my own son, I mean, I that's how. So he reads books. He's a very ferocious reader now. He's 7 years old. But what we simply did was he would just copy me and his mom. Both of us are readers, right? So we just have books. We bought books, and we let him read, and he just naturally started seeing what are these books about. And so we got all kinds. There's a book on how to teach your kids quantum mechanics. So he was reading about quantum mechanics for babies or stuff like that. And now he's into comics. So we don't actually channel him into you've got to read this, you've got to read that, right? We just kind of he just as long as it suits his interests, right? Like he knows he's interested in planets, he's interested in NASA. So I try to get books for that, And also just naturally when I'm doing my classes, he overhears me quite a lot. So he's like, "Daddy, what is the contingency argument?" So right. So he would come up to me like knowing like what are you talking about? So naturally we have these conversations at home. And I think having an atmosphere where you're constantly discussing ideas is also helpfully encouraging. I think that part of the problem is that we believe that the schools will do everything for us, but really the education or the infrastructure for proper education starts at home. You need to be able to cultivate that environment at home. And I feel that sometimes we don't end up doing that. I mean, don't get me wrong, parents are already overburdened. I mean, they've got finances to worry about. They've got, it's mortgages to worry about. So I understand if they're depleted in terms of energy, like, there's only so much you can spread yourself. But I think like at least trying to have an ecosystem in the house where there is this space to think, to encourage reflection is really key. And I think we sometimes lose that. I think
I think, as you're saying, it needs to be unforced. We need to create an environment where people can naturally explore without feeling they have to achieve goals or results, or and just let people. It took me a long time to appreciate the truth of that. I used to feel guilty that I wasn't systematically going down this channel reading, because I used to read all over the place. It was quite unsystematic. But I think you're right. That's fine, actually. That's not a deficiency. One must follow one's instincts on this, and that's cool.
Yeah. I mean, like I told, me and my wife, we have discussions about our son Jonah. Like, I have no problem, if he doesn't want to be an academic. I have no expectations of him being. If he seems to be very good at animation, so if he wanted to go to graphics himself, so be it, right? I don't want to force him, but as long as he's reading, he's thinking, that really is, I'd say, the most important thing. Because even if once he leaves the nest, so to speak, he has that he has this passion to read. And I think that really helps in developing a person a lot. I think so.
Can I ask you a question about the role of social media then in this? Because I feel guilty sometimes on blogging theology, and it's great. It's a huge privilege to talk to people like you and other scholars about their work. But are we not inadvertently killing off the interest in books, because we're encouraging people to listen and watch videos all the time, which of course is the competition on time and interest. If once we're hearing one of your videos on evolution and Al-Ghazali, what one might be aware of your book, but one might just stop at listening to the video or watching the video and not actually read the book. Is it not we're actually unintentionally countering this important, really this adventure of reading by producing content all the time?
Man. So I'll start off with what a book says. So there's a book by Nicholas Carr. It's called The Shallows. It's a very, very interesting book. It talks about, how the brain has morphed over time. Oh, yeah. And he has this very interesting narrative. So we had like significant transformations. So we went from an oral culture to a book culture. So that was one transformation. And then we went from a book culture to a computing culture. Right. And in each of these phases, we've had different impacts on the brain. So if you lived in an oral society where oral transmission really was key, your emphasis was largely on memory and eloquence. So, they would stress on those as very, very important traits. But when you enter now this book phase, right, memory is no longer deemed as important because everything can be outsourced onto paper. Right? It was more now about how well you wrote, how accessible the book was, that kind of thing. And then now, when we come into this computing phase, what is a good skill in this computing era is not so much how well you can read. It's actually more about being able to do multiple things at the same time. So Nicholas Carr in his book, he says, right now we have a person on his laptop listening to music, responding to emails, perhaps even, looking at social media. It's all about hyper threading you down. So the skill of the past was, so remember before electricity, how did people read? They'd turn a candlelight on and read, right? So you have to be very targeted in your approach. You have to be very direct. You have to be very clear about what you were spending your time on. Now, in this computing era, that kind of attention span seems to be very, very minimal. And it's for this reason. I don't know if you know, in movies, right? So I was looking at the psychology of movies. So, you have clips, right? So you have like a scene, and then you have a different camera shot, then you have a different camera shot. That gets smaller and smaller because our attention spans are getting shorter. It's by design. It's 3 seconds now. Right. So I was very surprised to see that every 3 seconds. That's why even on YouTube, when people are talking, you'll see hello and then another camera flip and then another camera. That's the reason why that happens. It's because the attention span is getting shorter. And I think that's a skill we're losing that doesn't just impact our reading, it impacts everything else, so to speak. Right?
True.
Yeah. So I think social media, now I believe it's a tool. Intrinsically, it's just a tool. It doesn't have any inherent value. It just comes down to how we are trained on how to use it. I believe that social media can be a force of good if you want to use it that way. That's why in my social media, I post nothing but books almost. Every time when I get a new book or when I finish a book or I try to summarize, I just post about books, because I want to encourage a culture of reading. Right? I use it for that purpose. Do I see other people using it for other destructive purposes? Yes. Now we're in an age, Paul, where I think we are overstimulated visually because videos are the currency.
Yeah.
Right? Now, does that mean that videos will replace books, or even these what do you call them? Audible. They now read books to you, so you're not actually looking at a piece of paper. You're now listening to books. What does that mean? Do people now need to not worry about having a piece of paper in front of them? I don't know. Right? I mean, I'm still a very physical person. Like I need to have books in front of me to be able to read. But we also have PDFs, right? And in an age of AI, where you can now just plug in PDFs into ChatGPT and say, summarize this for me, like give me a Twitter version of this post, right? So I don't know. The ecosystem seems to be, to one extent, if we keep pushing this idea that technology can make things simple for us, I think that's a good thing. You can use it to very helpful purposes. But I think implicitly, or if to the untrained mind, it may be able to, it may induce a culture of not emphasizing reading because everything is now visual, which is what more appealing to most people. Or it can be, you can get like a Twitter post of what this book is about. I don't know.
It's also, you mentioned Lord of the Rings earlier on. I've read Lord of the Rings, I think, probably 3 times in my life. When I first read it, I'd never seen the movie hadn't been made at that point. And I don't know if I was to read it again, how I would actually read it, because I'm so saturated by the highly successful movies that were made filmed in New Zealand. Whether it be Frodo or Gandalf or whoever, I know what they look like because I've seen them on the movies. But when I read this, if I read it again, what am I going to do imaginatively with this? Do I graft my cinematographer experience onto the book, or do I just try and park that to one side and just naturally develop my own imaginative reconstruction of what Tolkien is doing? And this is a choice. I mean, how do I encounter the book anymore, given we are this visual saturation of our lives? And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to, because my wife and I, we were both Harry Potter fans, right? And we read the books before the movies came out. Both of us had that, and so we share our depictions of how this character was like. So we have those conversations, and we even agreed that even the casting of Harry Potter was wrong. It should have been that actor, not this actor. So we can talk about that, right? But now, because we have this now visual corpus. Can I go back and now, change that? No, it's difficult. It's now there. I have a reference. Whereas I think reading prior to it becoming a film, you are able to imagine for yourself what these realities could be. And I think that's where the spark of creativity is.
Yeah, I
Whereas I
feel that people are lost to some extent because I've been given this imaginative landscape just to a passive. It's a passive thing. Whereas reading the books on your own without that, you have to generate these imaginative landscapes yourself. Otherwise, you're not going to follow. And there's another thing, but this is well known. I mean, the way that my appreciation of the Gospels has been not damaged, but it's been radically changed because I've read so much biblical scholarship on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament and the rest of the New Testament as well. I just can't read the Gospels like the Gospel of John in the naive, so-called naive, innocent way I used to, because immediately I'm triggered thinking all sorts of academic and historical and philological points, and it's a much richer experience. But I'm no longer reading it like a so-called sort of a patronize. I don't mean it patronize, like a naive Christian would, who just reads it, just the words, and it lets them impact their spiritual or mental life. I can no longer read that, and I know this has been discussed in the literature about rediscovering a second naivete. There's the initial naivete one has when one innocently encounters the Gospels, and then you go through this process of critical analysis and reflection through scholarship, and then you try to recover a second naivete when you can actually encounter the text afresh again. I haven't reached that. I'm not saying I particularly need to. I'm a Muslim now anyway, but there is a sense that my encounter with the text has been radically altered, and I've lost something of it because I'm too much aware of form criticism, redaction criticism, and all these other issues, and how the text is contrived, and what the agenda of it, and it's no longer a simple reading, and that's different from the Lord of the Rings issue. But again, it's the same thing of no longer just encountering the text. That one has other factors that interfere to some extent in one's spontaneous appreciation of it, perhaps.
No, but I think I definitely feel there, like I said, there are pros and cons, right? I think as you increase your education and your knowledge about things, naturally, when you go to those first texts, you may have a different way of looking at things. I go back to texts that I read ages ago. I remember reading Ghazali's works, I don't know, in 2013. After reading now all that I know, when I go back to Ghazali, there are things that I pick up, or things like, oh, now I know what he's indicating here. Like, for example, being in a very hyper-rational mindset, I couldn't really appreciate spirituality. I really couldn't. As a discourse, as a mode of thinking, I really couldn't. I remember my own teacher, my Sheikh Ali, he's my primary teacher, right? And he's the one who slowly walked me through from a purely hyper-rationalistic person to being able to really now appreciate what spirituality was. Him and my wife was also very much like that. And then now when I go back to that, I can see this interrelated framework where Ghazali, I think, kind of blends all these elements together. So I think with maturity, new connections emerge and new assessments emerge. Right, so I completely get that. Where I feel that the harm with this visual culture, this movie production culture, is that I think to a large degree, if that is our only input, it can potentially damage creativity. That said, however, I can see the other side saying, well, no, maybe it can open new venues for you. Right? You may have thought of like, for example, when I watched what's it called, Prometheus. Prometheus is this movie where, human life started with some kind of alien species. Their DNA was just, it just somehow made its way to Earth. It was by design, and that led to human life eventually, right? So that concept was for the first time introduced to me through Prometheus. I didn't know about directed panspermia, about the paper. This was so, and that got me thinking about aliens, which led eventually to stuff like this, right? The Islamic So I can see both sides, but I think the key thing, what I would advise, is not to make it your only avenue for learning. Make sure you have other avenues as well. I think if you just rely on movies, I think that can limit you quite a lot. I think so.
Gosh, yeah, absolutely. There's something incredibly enriching and beautiful and profound about reading wonderful literature that I've simply is not the same as reading a movie, and I think it's a much deeper. People often say, "Oh, well, the book's nothing like the movie." Well, indeed, the medium is so different. The book is often a much more profound experience. And although the Lord of the Rings films are amazing in terms of the visual spectacle, the books are a wholly different experience, I think,
Yes.
and much more profound. And
Yeah.
so I would always go with the book rather than the movie. Even that might be heretical to say that, but I always feel the book is more, it's more, yeah.
Well, I think people have gotten enough of our histories and our experiences with books. I think it might be helpful now to move on to the subject matter, which is reading strategies. So I'm sure you've gotten a lot of requests or questions about how do you go about reading. I have as well. So I thought it might be helpful to break this discussion down into 3 parts. So what do you do before you read a book? Do you do anything special? What do you read? What do you do during reading a book and after reading a book, right? So let's talk about before. Paul, do you personally do anything before you get your hands on a book? Anything specific, or no? You just, it's just organic. You just buy it and
No, it's a really good question, and it's not. The question is which book. I mean, there's too many books now. You go on Amazon, there's endless. So the really difficult challenge is actually finding the right book that I actually want to purchase. I used to go to libraries. I don't go to libraries. My library is now Amazon, I'm ashamed to say, but it's just the way it is. So it's selecting the right book. So the author, their expertise and so on is often the really challenging thing. So I have to do a bit of homework to find out who is the author, and book reviews as well. So what have other people said about this book? Is it really going to meet my needs? Is it at the right level? So I do a bit of initial investigation before I purchase the book, and that is often the most difficult phase for me. Because there's too much choice, too many books. Which one do I get? And someone asked me last week, "Oh, can you recommend me a really good edition of Plato's Republic?" And I just recommended the one I use, which is the Oxford University Press. It has excellent critical apparatus, has excellent commentary, notes at the back, has a brilliant introduction. The translation is very digestible, very readable. But I'd already done my homework on that, so I didn't need to reinvent the wheel on that. But so the hardest thing is actually selecting the book and the author in the first place, and then it's all downhill after that. Do you know what I mean? It's not.
Yeah. I get you. I think that for me, prior to reading a book, I think I may have 2 modes here, right? So books that I come across incidentally, right? And books that are advised by my peers. So I know already that it's gone through its own vetting processes.
Yes, this
right?
vetting process.
Yeah. So it's either through my colleagues at university or other shuyukh. They've told me to get this book, read through it. That this will be a good one, right? So either way, if it comes through either of those channels, I already have generally a high opinion of the text because I trust certain individuals when they suggest a book to me. But when I'm acquiring or when I come across a book incidentally, right, or by just by chance, what I do is I actually do the exhaustive role of investigating who the author is, right? What have other people said about the book? So I go on Amazon, check the reviews. If they're independent reviews, I check those out. And more importantly, I actually look at videos by the author where they summarize the book. So through that process, I already have kind of a semi blueprint of the book, right? And I'm able to see that I'm able to see what is opinion versus fact. I mean, that's a skill that people need to develop because you might be too swayed by a certain review only then to realize, hang on, that doesn't actually make sense. That person said this, but this is not what the book is saying. So you have to learn eventually how to remove opinion from fact, what the book is saying versus what is a person's interpretation of the book. That's why Amazon reviews are hit and miss. You have to be very careful. But with more academic outlets, and you usually get a good sense. You have a better compass there.
Yes.
Either way, I just have what I do is I have a general understanding of what the book is about before I actually acquire it. Then so when I have the book at hand, I then know, okay, this book is about XYZ subject, right? The author is this person, and they're trying to make a particular narrative. Now that I have that, I then walk through. That's the only thing I pretty much do before reading it.
I mean, this book is one I'm reading at the moment. It's called The Unintended.
Oh, that's an amazing book, Paul. That's an amazing book.
How a Religious Revolution Secularized Society by Brad Gregory. Now, how did I come across this? Because I think Hassan Spiker mentioned it. And in fact, surprisingly, a lot of Muslims were mentioning it. I said surprisingly because the author is a Roman Catholic. But I did the usual vetting process. So who is the author? Well, he's professor of early modern European history at the University of Notre Dame, as they say in America. He taught at Harvard, and it's won academic prizes. So okay, the guy's the real thing. He's a real scholar. And then the subject matter itself, the Reformation, how the unintended consequences of Luther and Zwingli and Calvin was to actually start a process of secularization in Europe, which of course is the backdrop to our world today, exported globally. So I thought, wow, this couldn't be more relevant as well. And it's a fascinating book, and I'm halfway through it, and I do highly recommend it. So I did the vetting process and the recommendations. There's a couple of videos of YouTube of him talking about giving a lecture on the book. So he ticked all the boxes. And although it is heavily Catholic in his interests, it is absolutely fascinating, and I think it's entirely valid thesis. So no, that's a really good example of how I came to read that book, through recommendation, through vetting, checking, and it meeting some intellectual interests I already have. So yeah, it's definitely. I'm glad you've come across it as well.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal book. I recommend it in terms of there's this one, and there's I think his name is Liam Gallagher. He's it's about new atheism and the Protestant Reformation, and they talk about it's pretty much twin strands basically, and it goes back to the Reformation. I need to remember the title, but I remember.
I'm interested. That's actually, if you could, that's on WhatsApp. Give me the name of it.
Yeah, I'll send it to your WhatsApp. Okay, cool.
I'd be interested to look at that actually. Go to the vetting and check it. Oh, okay, I'll read that. Can I just say something which is possibly very rude, and but I do want to say, people are very kind, and they often want to send me books. They say, Paul, I really want to send you my book, or you really must read this book. And and that's very sweet of them, and they do send me stuff. Okay, but the problem is I haven't solicited these books. I haven't vetted them. That they are books that other people feel that I ought to read. And the thing is, I already have a very long reading list already of stuff that I really feel I must read, and I just can't really fit these stuff. A lot of this stuff I can't fit it in. I just can't. I can't sincerely say, I'll read that next, because I've got other things that are much more higher priority that I have vetted and really feel it ought to read for academic reasons, because I've got other projects I'm doing. And so I really feel it almost feels like an imposition. They mean well and they're helping, but I can't assimilate all this stuff. It's just too much. And of course, I always try and be very polite and say that was very kind of you. And often the books are very good, but to be honest, I can't process them all. It's just too much, because I'm generating my own interest on my own reading list, and I just don't have the time. So this is the downside of it. I'm overwhelmed. So I'm trying to say it's a feeling of being overwhelmed, actually, and that is pretty much my reality forever now. It's just too much.
No, I think that to be honest, I'd rather be overwhelmed than underwhelmed. I think that's a better side to be on, right? But I think that draws on a good point for people who may be listening to this. That I think having a clear sense of priority is very important for reading, because you don't want to have a scattergun approach where you're just kind of reading everything left, right, and center. Well, I think that's good. That may be good for some people, right? It's kind of opening their horizons. But I think that as you begin to have liabilities, you get into work, you have family, your time of that's of use to you gets narrower and narrower. So you need to be very careful over, as you become older, what you want to prioritize. So for me personally, I know that I have several suggestions to read XYZ book, but it has to filter through what is my priority list. So I have high priority, medium, and then low priority reading items. And that for me helps me navigate how fast should I get to XYZ book or article, not even a book. It can even be an article. So to speak.
I read a lot of book reviews, these academic book reviews. Another thing I haven't mentioned so far is that for years I used to, it's quite funny and quaint looking back on it now. I used to feel this, it was almost like marriage. I felt I must be monogamous in my reading. So I'm only going to read one book at a time, because it would be unfaithful to the author if I was to dissipate my energies on other books, hint, hint, and And I went for a long time. I did this out of some misguided sense of loyalty to this faithfulness, monogamous sense of I must give this book my complete and exclusive, attention and not be unfaithful. Now, I mean, it broke down in the end because I simply wanted to be unfaithful. I really wanted to read other books at the same time. So I ended up reading, and it's always been the case for some time now, about 5 or 6 books at the same time, different kinds of books at different levels, because life is too short, and I really want to sample from a variety of sources. So I gave up this idea. It's completely impractical. And so I still have my favorites. The Unintended Reformation is definitely my number one interest at the moment. But I am reading Al-Ghazali. I'm reading other things as well, and books I have to read for future podcasts as well. So there are a number of works. All I'm just reading simultaneously, really.
Right. Okay. I mean, okay. I think that's also useful for in terms of tips for people. I do the same. I never read one book at a time. One, because particularly if you're an academic, you're set in a particular field, right? So you have to constantly make sure you're on top of the field, and sometimes that can get boring. Like there's only so much I want to reach. I want to sometimes maybe branch out, read something in science fiction, right? But what I usually do is I read 6 to 11 books at a time simultaneously, right? And I stop. That's why I have bookmarks to help me navigate that. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes it gets too much. I thin myself out. That's why I then reduce the number. It just depends on what I'm reading there. So that's one thing to keep in mind, whether you want to be, I like your terminology, by the way, a monogamous reader or a polygamous reader.
I meant, sorry, that was a bad analogy. I meant monogamy versus polygamy rather than being unfaithful, because I think they're both equally valid. So I need to quite adjust my metaphor there. Otherwise it sounds as if it's immoral. I don't mean to be immoral, but it's a sense of how do I, am I faithful to one, or do I allow myself to be faithful to 4, perhaps, or something?
Yeah, so I think that's a very, very good point. So I think one thing to keep in mind, particularly if you're reading, is which strategy do you want to adopt? Do you want to be one book man at a time or many books at a time? So that's definitely one thing to keep in mind. The other thing I wanted to mention was there are different kinds of books, right? So you have monographs, which are just books that are written by one author and they have a narrative from A to Z, right? But then you have things like edited volumes. Edited volumes are collections of essays that have been put together in a book. Like, for example, this the one I co-edited with Matthias. This is not a monograph. You have 9 chapters written by 9 different people, each one self-standing. So and you don't have to read that A to Z. You can read, you can dip in and out. So make sure that I think one thing I would advise is be very careful with what you are acquiring from the text. Many people assume that edited volumes are the same as monograph. You have to read A to Z. No, that's not the case at all. So I think that's also helpful for people out there. Did you want to add anything to that, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I read certain books in a way that probably no one would actually approve of or recommend, but I still do it, and I see the benefit that over the years. Say in New Testament studies, there are books, say, by Jimmy Dunn, professor at Durham University, on Christology or the history of the early church. These are big, fat tomes. They're academic tomes, hundreds of pages long, very influential, great reads. And what I did was, and again, I don't think anyone would approve of what I've done, but I still do it, and I will always do it, is I read every page of that book from beginning to end, every footnote, every comment at the back, everything. I hoovered the whole thing up. I didn't want to let a single word get past. Why? Because I wanted to absolutely benefit from and appreciate everything he'd written in that volume. I didn't want to. I mean, I had a friend of mine who was a brilliant student. He did PP at Oxford. Very, very bright guy indeed. Easily would have got a first at Oxford in politics, philosophy, and economics, but he didn't. And he told me the reason why, because he was quite lazy at Oxford. So he only read the minimum. He went to the index of the book and just read that particular section that he was required. He didn't read the whole thing. And it came out that the examiners actually discovered that's what he did. And he didn't get a first because he tried to do it on the cheap. No, he hadn't cheated, but he tried to do a minimalist course. And he lost out. But for me, I really want to suck the marrow out of certain books because they are so important and so academically central. Now, people say perhaps you shouldn't read in such a big, literally from beginning to end. So when I read that book by Ehrman Fordra, I did that. I've literally read every word in this book deliberately. I didn't want to miss anything. I think sometimes the footnotes can contain fascinating nuances of information that really matter, or the thing at the back will mention something. Now, that's not how I normally read other books, but it's just when it comes to really substantial academic works, that's how I want to, and I force myself through it sometimes. I systematically, it's like, doing your 10K a day or doing your running. This is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to boom, 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 boom. I'm going to master this book. And that's what I do sometimes. Other books, I'm much more laid back. So it depends on how momentous I think this book is, or significant, how I approach it. Sometimes it's almost in a military style. I will conquer this book and learn it and read it through. Otherwise, I'm much more like Al-Ghazali. I will parachute into the middle of it and swim around in that particular chapter of, the revival of the sciences. And that's it. I'm not going to be reading anything else by him at this moment. So, and other times I might read, revisit books. We haven't mentioned going back to old books. I will revisit, Shoaib Akhtar, that wonderful Oxford scholar who sadly is no longer with us, whose work I really adore and hugely love. I will sometimes parachute into that on a particular chapter. So I'm not obsessive about that. So it all depends on my relationship with the author, and but sometimes I'm really kind of hard line on myself, and other times I'm much more relaxed, but I'm happy with that. This works for me. It's been beneficial.
I think that's another point to draw on. So for example, this is a massive, this is the Revival of the Religious Sciences by Ghazali, right? Yeah. So I was very lucky. I actually got a 1-volume version of this text. It's usually like 4 or 10 volumes, depending where you buy it from, right? And so for me, I am planning to systematically go through it A to Z with commentaries. So there are commentaries on the Ihya as well. And for me, this is not like I'm doing it like I have to do this in a month. I'm kind of like, making this a long durational process. So something therapeutic as well, over a period of 3 to 5 years, and just kind of soaking it up as I go along. There are other times, however, when I have a paper that I'm working on or a chapter, I'll have to then read it A to Z, depending on the subject matter, right? So it depends on also the number of volumes, because it's unrealistic to be able to go through 10 volumes in a month. You have to draw it out to make sure you really soak it up and understand everything very, very carefully. So I agree with you on there that there's some books that are just so important that to go through each word, dissect it, is very, very important. But like I said, this comes down to your motives and objectives. If you are a casual reader and time is not really of importance, then you can definitely do that if you wish, right? If you have to now be selective based on your background commitments and your objectives at hand, you may have to be a bit more selective on how you want to go forward with that. That's a good point. That's a very, very good point. As for your point about, revisiting books, I've revisited books all the time. I've had to do that, right? But I this is the reason why, and I think this might be actually a good point to get to the next point, which is what do you do during when reading a book? What do you do during that phase? So when I read, so for example, here I've got The Muslim Creed by A.J. Wensick. So this is written in 1932.
Really?
So I have highlights. I don't know if you can see that.
You even use the same color highlighter than me.
Yeah. So I'm constantly like highlighting. Yeah. That's the one. That's the exact same one.
That's exactly the one I use.
Yeah, exactly the same one. So and for me, so when I need to go back to it, I know all the main points in there. I know the main points. Right? So that really is the key thing. I tell my students that if you genuinely want to understand a book and you've done it without highlighting, you've not read the book. I'm very strict with my own students. I tell them that if you haven't done that, then you've not actually read the book. Right?
No, I agree completely. I mean, during Ramadan, I read a portion of the Quran each day. I was reading from this translation, the Clear Quran.
Which one is this one? Who's the translator here?
This is Mustafa Katab. The Clear Quran. It's becoming extremely popular translation of the Quran, very readable. And during Ramadan, I read a portion a day, and you can see that So I highlighted, and I hadn't actually been through this Quran and looked at my highlighted passages since Ramadan this year. So I actually did that a couple of days ago, and I was so glad that I had highlighted these passages that particularly struck me, and I actually made a video about it, the most recent video about what happens to unbelievers after they die, and it reminded me of another book by Howard Storm, the American writer who anyway, I won't go into that, but yeah, so the highlighting was really helpful because I was able just to go in and remind myself of these extraordinary passages in the Quran. So.
MashaAllah, very good. So when it comes to the I want to ask you, so putting the Quran aside, that's an exceptional case, right?
Yeah.
But with monographs, I have a tendency, and I think some people may not understand why, that even if I've highlighted that point before, I will highlight that very point again in the succeeding chapters if I come across it. And the reason why I do that is because so the message sinks in. That's what I do, right? So that repetition allows me to kind of retain the most important parts of the book. Yes. Do you do something like that, Paul?
I'm not sure. No, I think actually, sorry, thinking about it, I do that, but I hadn't quite put it that way. But yes, that's what I do. So in this book, I'm currently reading Unto the Reformation. I've highlighted various passages as I've gone through, and there is repetition in that, yes. But I really, there's such a huge book. This I really need to highlight key points as they emerge and as they are repeated. Otherwise, I'm going to, if I do go back and do a video about it, or whatever, I'm going to be lost in this sea of words. So it really is absolutely necessary if I'm to get a handle on what he's been said at a future date. I also think I think in this book, I don't know if there might be a little bit of repetition going on. I think sometimes he likes to rephrase and restate a lot, and I'm thinking it could have been edited down quite a bit. But he is a very eloquent writer, so I don't mind too much. But I kept on thinking, well, hang on, you've already made this point before, and yeah, okay, it's interesting to be reminded, but maybe you didn't really need to say it. Yeah, that's kind of my thinking on,
Right. Okay. So highlighting is something we both share and do. That's good.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Gosh, yes.
What about so there's two more points that I think we can talk about here. Do you go through their references?
Oh, you mean, what do you mean? You mean the comments or the references at the back, or? Yeah,
reference at the back. So are you the kind of person who, you'll say, oh, where did it, so he's mentioning this author, let me find the name of that book, like.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, well, there's a notes at the back. If you mean.
Okay. Okay. Right. Okay.
So the notes at the back in this particular version are very fulsome, and it's almost a second book in itself, actually. Yeah. I much prefer when people put their notes and so on at the bottom of the page, because I'm constantly having to go back of the book. But yeah, I do check the reference. Absolutely. No, I do keep an eye on all these indicators. Yeah, just in case.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the I think that's a very important thing, particularly for those people who are aspiring to read up on an area, is when you are now coming across the same names or the same books, then that means your web of knowledge is increasing and you're becoming familiar with the field. That's why I tell my students that if you want to become a specialist, or if you really want to stay atop a field, learn to go through the references, find out who the big names are, find out what the big books are. And that's a way of kind of doing that. Is that a suspect that you have as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's building this kind of sense of intellectual network or web of people who are the main players in the field, getting to know their names. Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe with this Gregory book, Brad Gregory, less so, because I'm already familiar with some of the dramatis personae like Calvin and Luther and things. But I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I'm not going to read yet more books on Luther or more books on Calvin. I've done that before. Alistair McGrath, the great British academic at Oxford, who's a specialist on Reformation. In the past, I've done that. I'm not going to revisit that because I think, for my purposes now as a Muslim, I know enough really at this stage to be comfortable with that. If I was a Christian, I would continue with that, but I'm not. I don't want to dissipate my time too much on Reformation studies. It's no longer a central theological concern for me. Although it's important, it's not my center of gravity. I would end up marginalizing other writers of the Islamic tradition if I did that. So I have to be a little bit wary of getting seduced down that rabbit hole. Fascinating though it is.
Yeah. Okay, very cool. I have nothing else to my mind that I can talk about what I do during reading a book. Oh, okay. Here's one. Okay, here's one. So sometimes when I come across a new idea or an author that's mentioned in the book, I do go up and search up about that in the middle of my reading. Do you do that, or do you postpone
Yes.
those?
No, I do, and I regret that in a way, because it's so dangerous. I mean, I found myself, if I just, okay, I'm reading a book and I think, look, okay, I just look up this word or this concept. So I Google it. So I got my phone, oh God. And then of course, that in itself is a complete distraction. Because I mean, it really is not just this little thing. You think, oh, there's this link and there's that link, or maybe there's a YouTube video and all that. Oh, and before you know it, your whole experience of reading the book has been destroyed because you've been, So it really is very dangerous. And I mean, I don't have a dictionary anymore. I used to actually own a physical dictionary, but in a sense, I wish I still used it, because there's less potential of being completely diverted from the purpose, really. Now I just Google it, and of course that's what it means. Oh, that connects with that. Okay, let me have a quick look at that, and that's it. The day's gone. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I've had that. I've gone down that rabbit hole, and like I just had a simple question of who this person was. And I just end up wasting 3-4 hours just going through one link to another link to another link. That happens to you as well. So you kind of,
Yes, but I will say, when it's a positive experience, I mentioned earlier, I read every poem in this book, the Oxford Book of English Verse. And what I did was I often look, if I particularly liked a poem, I used to look on YouTube to see if anyone had actually recited this poem. And often they had. You get famous actors reciting T.S. Eliot, whatever. And for me, that was an amazing enriching of the experience. Not only was I reading it, I was hearing a brilliant performance of this poem. And that made the whole experience of the book much, much more amazing, actually. So that was okay. But if I'm reading academic books, it can be really destroy the whole thing if I get too casually interested in what's online about a given subject. It can be very diverting.
Right. So here's another one, Paul. I mean, to the same effect. So let's say you come across a paragraph, right? And this is a very juicy paragraph, and you just want to talk to somebody about it, right? So have you ever had moments where you've sent a WhatsApp of that paragraph to someone saying, hey, what do you think about this? Have you done that before? And then before you know it, instead of finishing that chapter at hand of the book, you spend the whole day talking about that paragraph with your colleagues.
Well, yes, I do. But I mean, the thing is, I did this 2 or 3 days ago. There was a particular ayah of the Quran, which I revisited after Ramadan. And then it reminded me of, about the afterlife. It reminded me of this book by My Descent into Death, A Second Chance of Life by Howard Storm. And I just made a video of it, and it's doing really, really well. And that was a very spontaneous, response to that. So I shared that paragraph with everyone, not just my friends. So, I've got a friend, Bassam Zawadi. He's got a stack kind of website, and he's often putting amazing quotes from secular writers. I mean, he put one up a couple of days ago about the terrible consequences of cohabitation. And this is a Western writer writing about, in an academic journal, anthology on sexual ethics. And he just gives this paragraph, and he put it on his website. It's sort of amazing. I just share that everywhere because it's a very it goes against the zeitgeist. It very much affirms Islamic understanding of and Christian understanding of marriage, the importance of marriage, and the dangers of cohabitation. So I think these snippets can be really helpful in terms of getting us to think again. They're paradigm shifting usually. So yeah, sometimes I would do that on my channel, sometimes on my other media platforms. So yeah, absolutely. You do that as well, I take.
Yeah. I mean, there's a paragraph where I know that one of my teachers might find interesting, or a colleague might find interesting, and so I send that a snapshot of it, and then we have a chat about it, seeing what we can get out of it, and that's usually very helpful because some of the things that we discussed actually come up later in the book. Either rejecting what we thought, or accepting what we thought, or even just staying neutral about the subject matter. So the reason why I point that out is because I think that given the kind of climate that we're in, we're very hyper connected, more than ever so before. I think applications like WhatsApp and whatever, they actually can be instrumental in the reading process, more so than I think it has ever been done in the past. Like Aquinas was not able to fact check something with his colleagues over WhatsApp, right? So I think that these are very important tools that could help the reading process.
And also in the teaching process, because in a very different way, I'm a teacher as well. So if I come across amazing quotes and paragraphs in books, I will try and utilize them in when I'm teaching, say, about history of Christianity, for example, in interesting takes on personalities or theological insights. So I try and enrich that by mining these quotes and keeping them around.
Yeah, I agree. I do that as well. If I need to, I'll just save the photo and then I'll put it up on my presentation slide to pick it up later. Right. Anything else comes to mind when it comes to what you do during reading? Anything else that you want to share, Paul, or do you think that pretty much covers it for you?
I think that probably covers it. I mean, there are perennial problems. I mean, there are practical consequences of what we do. I've literally run out of space in my apartment here. Every little corner has books in it, and so I'm going to have a cull in the coming weeks. I've got a friend hopefully who's going to come around, and we're going to go through all my books, and because they're very chaotic, unfortunately. Well, they're not as chaotic as it seems. There is some order to it, but I really need to cull and get rid of some of my books because I've got stuff going back which I really don't want to keep anymore. So there is these practical consequences of doing a lot of reading. What do you do with all these books? That's a major problem because I need to create some space. Otherwise, it's awful.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I think the idea of having lots of PDFs instead, on my desktop, PDFs don't do it for me. Except unless I'm having to read like book reviews or something like that, or someone sends me their book to look at. I mean, there's some very specific obligations I need to fulfill, but certainly by choice, not PDFs, the actual book itself, because for all sorts of reasons. Otherwise, I find it hard to sit in front of a computer screen and read a PDF. It's just not very nice experience, really.
Yeah, I mean, I've made a rule personally now that I'm never going to buy an edited volume. I don't want it to physically just occupy something there, just because a lot of these individual entries you can download as PDF articles, and so I can be much more selective and careful. So I made a rule. I think that edited volumes for me, unless it's like super important, unless the volume is incredibly important for my research, I'm not going to keep it around physically. But before I moved to Edinburgh, I had about 10,000 books around that mark. So, and there's no way that I was able to, transport 10,000 books to the UK. So what I ended up doing was I gave 5,000 to charity, thereabouts, and the rest of 5,000, I shipped them to Edinburgh. But you have to constantly go through your library, so to speak, to keep things realistic and practical. My wife has been very, very okay with it so far. She knows that, I'm an avid book reader, and so that's not been a problem. But I know that for some couples that may be an issue. I know that sometimes people on either side, either the wife or the husband, has had to tell the other, "This is too much now. You got to get rid of some stuff."
I'm definitely due for a culling now. It's been too long, and just a general reordering of books. So I'm gonna So that's definitely on the cards, inshallah. So.
Oh, okay. This actually reminded me. I just remember. So I don't do this, right? This is something I've started very recently, right? So I never write on my books. I just highlight. But very recently, what I've started doing is I've actually started, making. Let me see if I can change my camera settings. Just a second.
Yeah.
Virtual background, none. So I've started making notes on the sides. I mean, I never used to do that at all, and I specifically just started doing this in more now Arabic texts. And I don't know why, and to be honest, I never thought I would ever be the kind of person who would write in books. I mean, I had a very aesthetic relationship with books, that they should be pristine, etc. So it was a huge compromise getting the highlighters. But just recently, I'm talking about the last 6 months, very, very recently, I've been now, making these notes. And I remember some of my colleagues were like, "Shoaib, what are you doing? You don't do that." But to be honest, Paul, I really like this way of engaging a book because I'm now able to really as if I'm talking with the author. Like I'm leaving questions behind, and then I go back to those questions later. and I just find it very almost as if I have somebody in front of me talking to me. Have you ever done stuff like that, Paul?
No, I don't tend to write. No, I've not actually done that, to be honest. No, it's highlighting for me is my way of singling out really significant passages.
Yeah.
Except when I'm using books for teaching, then I do sometimes write on them. But that's in terms of, start here, read that, don't read that. Or in fact, I do some terrible things. I cross through lines. So when I'm reading a text in teaching, that for me is blocking that out. Don't read it. So that's a bit desecrating, I suppose. But no, in terms of yeah. But that's I just need to do that. Otherwise, it gets too complicated, really.
So sorry. The reason why I started doing that is because when I read now, sometimes I've got my teaching cap on, right? So how might this help a student? So what I do is, I don't know if you can see that. Oh man, 1 second. Let me see if I can get rid of this virtual background. Can you see the text now? Is it clear?
Now.
Yeah.
Gosh, yeah.
So sometimes I'm like, I draw these tables in just to kind of summarize everything that I've learned, right? And that's to kind of help with understanding some concepts. So that's why,
I'm impressed. Very impressed, actually, with that. I've never done that. Maybe I should start thinking about being more. Wow.
Yeah, to be clear, I never thought I would ever do that. I was always against, writing in the text. But I don't know what it was that encouraged me to do that. I think because I saw some of the books that I have are actually from other scholars. So they've shelved their books, right? They wanted to get rid of them. So, and I noticed that they had their writing in pencil, so they would write on the sides, Marginalia, and this was even something that you find even in old Arabic manuscripts. And so maybe that was something that encouraged me to do that. But and I never thought I would be that kind of person. But it's really helpful. I don't know. It's a different way of engaging with the text rather than just mere writing. I'm making notes. I'm putting, teaching references. I'm putting all kinds of things are coming to the fore when I do this. And I don't know why. It's been very positive. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So I think that's pretty much from our side. I think during reading, is there anything that you do after reading, Paul? Like once you've finished, what do you do?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it depends on the book, really. I think that there is, in terms of one's consciousness, there is the after reading experience of living with the memory of the book. So if it's a particularly profound poem, or I mentioned Dickens, I mentioned George Eliot, or Plato, what one's consciousness has been affected by that, infused with the experience of the text. So that's not a doing thing, but that's a living thing. That is letting it. So the process of reflection, assimilation after the reading experience. If it's a more mundane book, then the book simply gets shoved with hopefully the other books of a similar subject somewhere behind me or somewhere else in the apartment. But well, that's a bit random these days. So I will make a video about it. I do that from time to time. Book reviews, that helps to, and also one of the great learning experiences for me is actually talk to other people about what I've read, and I do that at Speaker's Corner where to explain the concepts, which are often quite subtle concepts, to actually articulate them and explain them to other people. That helps to really embed them and make them part of the furniture of the mind, really. I think those are the kind of after reading the book processes that I go through, but depends on the book, really, actually, and where I'm at in my situation. What do you have anything in mind?
Yeah, so let me ask you more specific questions, because these are the questions that I get from either people on social media or Facebook. So a very popular question is, do you write summaries of your book, of the books that you've read? Yes or no?
No.
Okay.
Because it's part of it. Usually the books I read are part of an ongoing dialogue with other books and other concepts. So it's not the book. Well, it is the book, but it's also how it connects with other people or other ideas. So, I mean, to give a pretentious example, so if one's reading Kant, the philosopher Kant, one's not just reading Kant. One has one's mind on David Hume. I'm thinking of David Hume because he's from Edinburgh, of course, or Descartes, the rationalist. So it's always part of a nexus of other things. So it's that I hold in my mind rather than the discrete kind of specific content. It's how it fits in with the larger network or map, as I call it, of things. And it's that I ruminate on and try and understand the connectedness of what's been said. And it's ditto for this book. I'm less concerned with his summaries, important as they are, but how it changes my view of the West in general, and particularly trying to integrate that with an Islamic perspective as well, which he doesn't do. So I try and step outside of the book itself and look at its larger place on the map. That's often what I do, and is that carry around in the furniture of the mind. That's
Right.
how I do.
I like that. Yeah, I have the same approach that I never read a book in isolation. It's usually because I have a particular inquiry or it's an ecosystem that it's part of. Okay,
Exactly.
so you don't write book summaries, fair enough. But do you have like a book filled with notes? Do you do that? That's another question.
No, I don't. Maybe I should actually. No, but people keep journals, or no, indeed. Yeah. I wish I had in a way over the years. It would have been interesting to see where I've gone, but no, I don't. So you do that, I take it, do you?
No, I don't. I don't do that at all.
I thought you were gonna feel, oh my god, you do it too. No, I don't actually. I think because it's just too much. It's too much hard work, and also because I'm just doing it for myself. Really, I don't really feel the need to have that. You know, I've got the highlighted passages. If I've integrated it, if I've got the wider kind of map in my mind, then I don't really need to have that. You know, if I want to go back to the secularization hypothesis in the West, I'm thinking Peter Berger. I'm thinking, which I'm not mentioning, you know, Brad Gregory.
Charles Taylor.
Absolutely, Charles Taylor. I know the key guys. I remember the books. I just go back to them. I don't have to write out mechanically a summary of the book because maybe I should. I don't know, but no, I don't.
But so this is the reason why I highlight the same point sometimes again throughout the book, so that the message is in. I don't need to write a note. It's just now there, right? Of course, do I need to revisit books? Yeah, it's human fallibility. I know as I get older, I might lose memory, right? So it's there. I know where I can find it, right? But I never have like a dedicated space or a dedicated set of notes where I jot everything down. For me, that doesn't really help at all. I think it's the actual moment to moment engagement where you highlight, where you write a note. That's it. That should suffice. I think I don't know why people feel compelled. Maybe it's their own learning methodology that they need to kind of revisit the text. But I suspect, I may be incorrect in this, I suspect it's because the first time that it was read, it wasn't read with that sinking in message. So you know how we talked about when we come across a concept which we don't know, we then go online and we search for it until we finally nail the concept down or the individual down. So I think we chisel it to death as we read through that reading. Whereas I think where other people, I don't like to use the word superficial reading, but I think it's a first glance reading rather. And I think not everything has sunk in, which is why they feel the necessity to kind of, would you agree with that?
No, absolutely. No, absolutely. I think people have to find the reading styles and the learning styles that they're comfortable with. I don't think there's some kind of template that people should adopt. I think that's a mistake. Because we're all different. We have different motivations and desires when it comes to books. So this is because people often say to me, "Well, Paul, what book would you recommend for a Christian about Islam?" And I'm thinking, well, obviously apart from the Quran, and I want to know things about their age, their education level. I want to know, do they read books? Do they even read books? I mean, it's all very well meaning to give this guy a book, but he's not going to read it if he doesn't read books, probably. So I need to know a lot more about this victim that we're going to impose stuff on before we do it, because otherwise we're just going to shove stuff at people they're not going to be interested in. It really needs to be tailor-made. We need to. There's so many questions I want to ask, and I do ask before I recommend. I mean, I like to recommend Guy Eaton to everyone, but I absolutely don't, because he will not be appreciated by some people. He just won't be. So it's just a waste of space. So I might recommend something quite different. So yeah, we have to ask those questions. But books need to be tailored to the individual, I think.
Right. Okay. So here's another one. So what I usually do, because at least through my own academy, I actually have books that are the primary reading material for courses, such
Yes.
that every lesson is tailored to a chapter, right?
Yeah.
So what I do is, maybe after reading a chapter, I set up presentation slides based on that book. This is only
Yeah.
because I teach that book, not necessarily because I do it for my personal benefit, so to speak.
Yeah.
Do you think that, one, is that something that you would do, or have you done in the past?
Yeah, I mean, we Hassan Spike and I have set up the Blogging Theology Academy, which has been going
Right.
since April, and we've just finishing the first semester next week. So I'm teaching the history of early Christianity and the Bible and the early Christian tradition, and I've had to kind of create material for each course, for each week. So I found myself drawing on a whole bunch of stuff, books I've read over the years, and just reaching out for them, taking material and trying to craft something that is can fit into the time frame. There's recommended reading. There's things they have to read in advance. So it's, I'm kind of really inventing it all for me for the first time, and that's been quite intensive. But hopefully next year, if the course continues, I would have done the legwork. But there's so much material, so it's a question of really paring it down to key texts, and I'm very much aware the level of the audience is very high level. These students are very bright. They've been interviewed. These are people at Oxford and Harvard are on it, students, and so I can really kind of just push the envelope a bit and not worry too much about that. So it's been great fun, and also in the teaching experience, encouraging people to ask questions and be proactive and interested in the material, which they are. So they're not passive recipients of the stuff. But no, it's been great being able to actually draw on a lot of the books that I've read and actually be able to share it, whether it be through slides or extracts on the screen or reading it out. And again, reading it out is not just has to be read out in a certain way, which is engaging, hopefully, and meaningful. You're communicating a message. It's not like reciting from the telephone directory. One has to do it in a certain way, or to capture, or the purpose of capturing the students' interest and imagination. So, no, that's been a lovely experience, and so far, alhamdulillah, the feedback has been good. And Hassan Spiker, he puts a lot of Aristotle up there, Plato. Today he's teaching Kant at a high level, quoting from his own book and Kant as well. So, he's very, very good at that. He is also using humor, wit as well helps to try and leaven the whole process of engaging with books when one's quoting from them. So it's a bit of a multi-skill process, really.
Right.
Which I'm learning to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Alhamdulillah. Okay, very good. I don't have any other questions about what I do after reading a book. Anything else comes to your mind, Paul, that you think we can share with the wider audience?
No, not really. I think I've inflicted my opinions enough. I just think I think reading is so important, and I think it's been marginalized in our day and age, sadly, because there's so much sensory input and there's so much distraction going on. But I, like you, I will continue to promote the value of reading and good books. I read some dreadful advice. It was several years ago. I think it was a government minister or something said. She said she was encouraging people to read books. I thought, well, that's nice. And she said, yeah, it doesn't matter what you read, just read books. And I'm thinking, that's dreadful advice. I mean, there's some really awful books out there, and probably better you never ever read them at all. It's a sense of it doesn't matter what you read as long as you're reading. That's what matters. No, it does matter. It's like it doesn't matter what films you read as long as you're watching some film. Well, no, there's an awful lot of crap out there. So it was that kind of unintelligent kind of just throwing books at people approach. No, one needs to be. Well, we've discussed this at greater length. One needs to be discerning and choose good books. Reading good books, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think though, I think that's where I think people who are not academics or who don't have a very strong drive to filter books. I think really good advice for those people would be to rely on maybe people they follow. Like for example, if I'm entering an area which I don't know much about, let's say for example. Reform Judaism, for example, right? I would seek the advice of people who are in that field, because then because what is the difference between me and them? They've sifted through everything
Yeah.
out there? Do you know what's rubbish versus what's good? Right. So I think having that channel or avenue can be very, very helpful. So that's one thing.
I think it's a really important point you're making, actually, because how do we know what to read? Okay, I'm interested in Islam. You know, someone who doesn't know, you know, and they go online, they go on Amazon, and they put in the word Islam. You're going to have thousands of books. So how do you navigate this book? How do you choose? So you need guide. One needs a guide. And I suppose before, in the past, the Islamic tradition, one had guides. So you mentioned Sheikh Ali, I think it was, who of course pre-selected helpful material. But now often people don't have that. So yeah, we need to speak to people who do have knowledge to, you know, get those good books. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves. I mean, there are some very eccentric books on Islam written by very marginal scholars who will, you know, tell you that Mecca never existed or whatever. I mean, whatever, you know, we need to go with the mainstream and learn the facts before we go off with these wacky theories. And so potentially quite dodgy, really. One needs to have good guidance about good books. Yeah.
And I think what might help and add to that is you can ask the same question to various experts in the same field. And then what I do is I'll ask, what's the top 5 books in this subject matter? And I usually get, like, you know, suggestions from 3-4 people. And then I automatically see 3-4 titles is on everyone's list. So those are like the must get. And then the others are due to their own personal subjectivities. So that's a really way. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I just forget. I want to say one thing. It's something that C.S. Lewis said, because C.S. Lewis taught philosophy at Oxbridge. I forget if it was Oxford or Cambridge at one point. So he wasn't just a great fiction writer and so on. And he was asked, his advice was to students who would ask him, well, I mean, his advice is this. You'll be asked, what books would you recommend that I should read about philosophers? So can you recommend a good book I should read about Plato? And he said, no, what you should do is read Plato. Don't read books about Plato, read Plato, because the books about him are often far more difficult and obscure and off-putting than Plato himself. Plato is accessible. You can simply go straight to the philosopher, one of the greatest philosophers of history, and read him, because it's all dialogues, apart from his letters. You know, it's entertaining, it's interesting. So, you know, cut out the boring academic middleman and go straight for the philosopher. There's only 1 or 2 exceptions to that rule, I think, where it probably comes to Kant or Hegel, who's pretty unintelligible, pretty much. Peter Singer the philosopher, has a great introduction on Hegel for the very short introduction to Oxford series. But usually you can go straight to these guys. You don't have to read a book about things. And it's the same, a book about Islam. Well, read the Quran. Just read the Quran in a good modern translation. If you don't know anything about Islam, read the Quran. You're not going to get a better intro to what Islam is about than God's own book, even if it is in English, not the original. So I think there is this thing about, you know, we should talk to other people first, not read. No, go straight to them, with 1 or 2 exceptions. That wouldn't work in science, of course. So, you know, you wouldn't sort of, we want to know about physics. Well, read Einstein. No. But I think in other areas you can do that. You can go straight to the author himself without these stupid intermediaries who will just confuse and obfuscate. You know, they're not going to give you that clarity of access. They're going to raise all these other issues which are going to obscure the thing. Anyway, that's my advice.
Yeah, I think that it might also help to note that, you know, particularly when you're going through like big topics. Keep in mind that, you know, there are various ways of tackling those subjects. So you can do it by author, so going through by author. And again, the question is, read the primary versus the secondary literature. It depends, you know, what you're trying to do. Then you also have, you know, topics by history or topics by the subject matter. So philosophy, for example, you can read a history of philosophy, and that's just, you know, starting from Plato to contemporary times. And, you know, like Frederick Copleston, in my opinion, has the best work on the history of philosophy, that 11-volume set. I really, really.
But you see, although I'd say you have a good point. There's a danger. Bertrand Russell has written a very famous thing, Introduction to Philosophy, but he's awful. I mean, it really is. It's a dreadful book, and no academic either ever recommends this book now. But it's there on the book water. So, there's a Bertrand Russell, a famous philosopher. We must get that. The nice cover on it. No, don't read that book. Just read some philosophers. You know, read some Descartes, but read Kierkegaard. I mean, it's scintillating. Or read Nietzsche. These are fascinating please don't read Bertrand Russell's introduction. I mean, you like Copperson. I actually not really that keen on him, but it works. That's great. So there are some, good ones like Copperson's. But
why are you not into Copleston, Paul? I would love to know.
I bought one of his books. I forget on which philosopher, and I thought, really, I'd much rather read. I mean, again, my preference for the primary source itself.
Right.
Rather than reading books about X, why don't you just read X? I mean, why do I need someone else? I mean, well, what I do is I read the original, and then I will go to a writer like Copperson on Aquinas, for example, because he was a priest, Jesuit, wasn't he? Then I'd read him, but not. First of all, go to one of the Summas. Just dive into the Summa Theologica, enjoy what he says about the being of God, whatever, and then go perhaps to a commentary on it. I think we get it the wrong way around, but that's just my view.
Yeah, no, I agree with there. I'm kind of highlighting the different ways that people can approach subject matters.
Yeah, no, people can do that. But don't read Bertrand Russell on the history of philosophy, please. It's a disaster.
No, I think I share the same point. So, all right, okay. So I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I think I hope that this provides, this becomes a useful source for many people who are interested in books. The last point that I had was, I mean, I did have a point here about, is reading becoming an extinct skill, right? But I think we've touched that already. I don't think we need to go over that. But what I wanted to end with was, do you have any general advice, given what we've said, or to summarize anything that we said earlier? What would be the general advice from your side, Paul, to people who want to read or may find reading difficult? What would you say to them?
There is an amazing universe of amazing treasures out there for you to discover. It's if you enjoy great films, if you enjoy, going to great cities in the world, you will enjoy exploring, like an explorer, great treasures of books that exist. They're just waiting for you to sample. They're there. They're accessible. It's an amazing adventure. You'll thoroughly enjoy. It will change your life, open up new worlds, new vistas on different universes. It's a form of time travel because you're encountering people's thoughts from 1,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, when it comes to Plato and Aristotle, Socrates. What's not to like? Enjoy the journey. There are travelers who've been on this journey before you. Maybe talk to them about their experiences of the journey. But it's one of the great experiences of being human in this life, is to go on that journey of discovery of other worlds, of the past, because they did things differently in the past, and that can help us understand the peculiarities of our present and perhaps take ourselves less seriously as somehow, the bee's knees. People had sometimes better ways of doing things in the past as well, and one can really appreciate. And it's a form of not just time travel, but also going abroad. What one can travel to Italy or Persia or ancient Greece, and through their literature, and learn about different civilizations. And I don't mean books about. There's nothing worse than reading a travel guide. You need to actually go and travel, and that's what I'm saying. Don't read books about these people. Actually read them yourself. I mean, an extraordinary book, which I shouldn't recommend. There's apologies to everyone. I'm probably going to get criticized mercilessly for recommending this if anyone has got through this far to 2 hours. But I'm going to say this with all the caveats, and please don't crucify me. I really like Dante's Divine Comedy. Dante was an Italian poet. He wrote this so-called Divine Comedy. It's not funny, but it's his travels to hell, purgatory, and heaven. Yeah. Now, the reason I'm not going to go into why Muslims don't like this book, and I completely understand, but if you can somehow put that to one side for a second and appreciate the sheer genius of Dante, who, with his mate Virgil, this ancient Roman guy, they actually travel through hell, the different circles of hell, and they meet these amazing people. And it's like Lord of the Rings, but better. It's an extraordinary writer. It's one of the great works of Western literature. This Italian guy from the 13th century. Wow, read it and enjoy hell, and be warned. It's a very moral book written by a very Catholic writer. And then as he goes up to purgatory, Mount Purgatory, and he ends up in paradise. Extraordinary experience reading this stuff. So go on the adventure. Be aware you're going to encounter horrible things, like some of the things he said. I'm not going to go into the details, but also appreciate his genius as well, if you want to. I'm not saying you must read him. I'm saying if you do read him, you'll have amazing discoveries to behold. So, yeah, what's not to like? I mean, the journey itself, what's not to like, is amazing, and go for it. That's all I can say.
Yeah, but I think that's very beautiful advice. I mean, I would echo what Paul said there, and just add the fact that I mean, I appreciate that people have different commitments, and time management can become very hard to factor in it, because people are busy. I get that, and I think that's why there's a move toward Audible, where people want to hear books as opposed to read.
That's good. I agree for that.
Yeah. But my parting advice would simply be that, in addition to what Paul said, that remember, these are all worlds to be explored, right?
Exactly.
But also bear in mind that there is a huge difference between scholars, academics, and laity. Academics, their job is to read. That they're being paid to read. It is part and parcel of what they do. So, because what sometimes I feel is people they sometimes get so disappointed that they can't keep up. That comparison should never be there. It should never ever be there, right? It is, if my job was to not read books, I would specialize in what I need to do to be good at my job, right? This doesn't mean that you remove reading from the equation. I would never say that. Reading should always be there at the background somehow. But the reason why myself and Paul and others, the reason why books are part of, we share books all the time, is because we do this almost would you be correct to say, Paul, you read almost on a daily basis? Would that be correct to say?
Of course, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, it goes without saying. Yeah.
So that's part and parcel. So I really want people to appreciate the fact that don't feel a sense of disappointment if you're not like consuming that much. And even though it's very good that you feel that you want to be able to, that shows a thirst for knowledge. That's very, very good. But that shouldn't necessarily make you feel bad about yourself, because I notice sometimes online people ask those questions, and I feel like they feel a sense of displacement. That should never be there. That was one thing I wanted to put out there.
No, I think that's absolutely right. But also the sense that, I try and do 10K a day. I know the 10K, this is sort of walking. I mean, I know that was invented by a Japanese advert guy in the the whole thing about 10,000 steps a day.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, and I think what one gets used to doing that. It becomes part of one's routine. It's not something that what one has to think, oh gosh, I must do that. It's just what one does. And it'll be good. It's great if people can also create that routine with reading as well, where it just becomes part of one's life. I don't mean they have to do it all the time, but at least do it a lot of the time, where, like exercise, reading is just what we do amongst all our other commitments as well, time permitting and all that, of course. But I appreciate also that many people are not, if you have families and they've got long jobs, it's, this is slightly elitist, perhaps. Maybe it's a privilege rather than something we can all do all the time. So I should be aware of that.
I think the key point is, have a sense of realism, pragmatism. Like, there should be a realist sense there. And that's the only thing I wanted to kind of conclude with, is because I don't want people to feel disappointed they can't keep up, or they, that should never be there. It just depends on your frame of life, what you're doing, where you are in your career. I just think that
also, you're absolutely right. Also, I want to stress, don't miss out. Don't miss out on the journey. The journey is there. It's very easy these days. Books are ubiquitous online, and they're cheap these days. Don't miss out on the journey, because it is extraordinary, and it's a lifetime, as many lifetimes worth of travel, and enjoy it, because it's worth it.
I think, just to end it off, I think that the first verse, arguably the first verse, "Iqra bi'ismi rabbika alladhi khalaq," right? Read in the name of your Lord, right, who created. So I think that should be really there's a theological motivation here to go out and read. So do take that as a
nice way to conclude. Yeah, it's a lovely way to conclude, actually. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Shall we wrap it up there?
I just want to say thank you, Paul. I mean, like, I did not anticipate this would be over 2 hours. So alhamdulillah. But this was very good. I mean, I learned a lot from our exchange, Paul. I got to know you so much better, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, it wasn't always easy to talk, particularly in the early part of the video. But no, it's a tribute to your skill that you brought that out. So yeah, thank you very much indeed, and best wishes with your new job, pioneering work in the field of science and Islam, and really wish you the best of that. You start, is it August next month, is it, you say?
And literally in 10 days from now, yeah. So my duty starts officially on the 1st of August.
At a great university in Scotland. So
I'm very privileged. Alhamdulillah. I'm very grateful to Allah for that.
I'm sure your presence in Scotland will be hugely enrich the intellectual life there. And really looking forward to seeing what you do and what happens. So,
inshallah. And hopefully, Paul, we can invite you to Edinburgh, and we will do a lot of fun things here as well, inshallah.
Oh, that'd be lovely. I do like Edinburgh. I've been there several times. Extraordinary place, actually. So I'd very much be honoured to visit again. So thank you very much. Until next time, God bless, and speak to you soon, inshallah. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.